There's a photograph, the kind that turns up in an old shoebox or a stapled family album, dated in pencil on the back, 1955. A woman stands in a kitchen doorway, apron still on, the stove behind her still throwing heat. You can almost feel through the print. It's black and white, but you can tell the window behind her is open because the curtain is caught mid-motion and there's a jar cooling on the sill that nobody bothered to explain because nobody looking at that photograph in 1955 would have needed it explained. That's the thing about a photograph like this. It doesn't tell you what she was thinking or what she weighed or whether the day had been a good one. It tells you what was on the counter. It tells you the stove had probably been warm since before the sun came up, and that her sleeves were rolled to the elbow because there was work still ahead of her. If a piece of that kitchen ever reached you, even secondhand, even as a story told at a table long after the kitchen itself was gone, then this one is for you. Before the refrigerator hummed in every corner of America, a farm kitchen ran on knowledge that never got written down because it didn't need to be. It lived in hands. It passed from a mother to a daughter, or skipped a generation and turned up again in someone who couldn't quite say where they'd learned it. Nothing in that kitchen was wasted because nothing could afford to be. Fat went into a crock. Cloth went into a dress. Even the last light of a Sunday afternoon went into a jar of something that would feed the family in February. Nothing left that kitchen with a use still left in it. That was the whole religion of the place, unspoken, uncomplicated, and almost entirely gone now. Here are 15 pieces of it. See how many still ring a bell, even a faint one, even one you can't quite place. Number 15. The root cellar. Dug straight into the earth, sometimes no more than a few feet square, sometimes big enough to stand up in. It held its temperature at somewhere around 50 degrees no matter what the weather was doing above ground. Potatoes went in buried in sand. Carrots and cabbages went in loose. The trick was in what you kept apart. Apples were known to hasten the spoiling of everything around them, so a careful farm wife kept her apple bushels off in their own corner, away from the potatoes they'd otherwise ruin. There was no refrigerator waiting to save a mistake. Today, you can walk into any supermarket in January and buy a tomato grown somewhere. It is currently summer. Back then, what the cellar held was what you had, and what you had was what you ate until spring came around again. Number 14, Hog Butchering Day. It came in the cold months, after the first hard frost had settled in, because warm weather turned the whole business into a losing race against flies and spoilage. Neighbors came from down the road to help because one family alone couldn't manage a job this size, and there was an understanding that you'd return the favor when it was their turn. The whole animal came apart that day. Hams for curing, sides for bacon, organs for the pot. Nothing left in the field. The trick, if there was one, was patience with the cold. Wait for it, and the meat would keep through winter. Rush it, and you'd lose the whole animal to spoilage before the salt ever had a chance to work. Now, meat arrives at the store already cut, already wrapped, with no neighbor's name attached to any part of it. Number 13. Rendering the lard. This was the second half of butchering day, usually the women's work, while the men finished with the meat. Chunks of fat went into a big pot over low heat, and slowly, hissing and popping, they gave up a clear, golden liquid, leaving behind crisp brown cracklings that got eaten on the spot or folded into cornbread. The trick was heat control. Too hot, and the lard scorched and turned bitter. Low and slow was the only way, strained twice through cloth before it went into the crock to cool and turn white. For generations, this was simply what a kitchen cooked with. Then, starting in 1911, a company called Procter & Gamble began selling something new, a shortening made entirely from cottonseed oil, marketed as purely vegetable, clean, modern, nothing like the animal fat your mother used. Within 5 years, Americans were buying more than 60 million cans of it a year. By the 1950s, scientists were also raising early concerns about saturated fat in the diet, which only helped push lard further out of fashion. Today, a whole industry of vegetable oils sits on the shelf where that crock used to be. Number 12. The feed sack dress. 100 pounds of flour or chicken feed came wrapped in cotton, and by the 1920s the companies selling it had figured out that a pretty printed pattern sold better than a plain sack. A farm wife learned to read a sack the way you'd read a bolt of fabric at a store, and she learned the trick of getting the company's name off it, soaking the inked lettering in lard or kerosene overnight until it lifted away clean. It usually took 2 or 3 matching sacks to make a single dress, so a household with a lot of chickens saved and traded with neighbors to gather enough of one pattern. By the early 1950s, cheaper paper packaging had mostly ended the practice. Number 11. The bacon grease tin. Every stove had one, usually an old coffee can kept close at hand, and every bit of fat left in the pan went into it rather than down the drain. The trick was simple. Strain out the crumbs before it goes back in, so it stays clean for the next thing it fries. Cornbread, greens, the Sunday eggs, all of it touched that tin sooner or later. Nothing replaced it. It simply stopped being saved. Number 10, canning day. Late summer meant the kitchen filled with steam and the windows fogged over, jars lined up by the dozen, tomatoes and green beans, and whatever the garden had given that year going in hot and coming out sealed. The trick was in the sound, a small metallic pop as each jar cooled and the lid pulled itself down tight. And a good canner learned to listen for it rather than trust her eyes. Now, a grocery store carries every vegetable, every month, shipped in from wherever it happens to be growing. Number 9. The spring house. Built low over a running spring, it used the cold of the water itself to keep butter and milk from turning in the heat. The trick was sight and nothing else, running water never standing, because standing water warmed. It did the job of a refrigerator for generations of farm families before electricity reached rural areas widely in the early 1950s. Number 8. The wood cook stove. Cast iron. Always burning. It heated the whole kitchen along with whatever was cooking on it. There was no dial, only feel. A hand held near the surface, a practiced sense of how hot was hot enough. The electric range that eventually replaced it was easier and cleaner, but it never quite became the heart of a house the way the old stove had been. Number 7. Leather breeches. That was the name for beans dried whole on the vine, strung on thread, and hung along a porch rafter or a kitchen wall to cure through the fall. The trick was stringing them whole rather than shelling them first, so that come winter, they'd soften back up properly in a pot of water, rather than turning to mush. Number 6. The quilting bee. Every scrap left over from a feed sack dress or a worn-out shirt went into a basket rather than the trash, and once enough scraps had gathered, women came together, sometimes a whole afternoon's worth of them, to piece it all into something warm. Today, a blanket is bought finished in an hour by one person alone. Number 5. The kitchen garden. Planted close to the house, tended before breakfast and again in the evening, it was neither hobby nor decoration. It was where a good half of the family's food started. Now, a garden, if there is one at all, is often just a few pots on a porch, and dinner starts at a store instead. Number 4. Soap made from rendered fat. Leftover tallow and lye cooked down together in an outdoor kettle until it thickened into something that could be poured into a mold and cut into bars once it set. The trick was knowing when it was ready. Tested with a feather or a whole egg dropped into the mixture, since there was no thermometer built for the job. Before we get to the last few, a small pause, one breath, nothing more. If any single thing on this list was already sitting in the kitchen you came from, whether you lived it or only heard about it, take a second and hit subscribe. You already know this channel is yours. Number 3, Sunday dinner. The good tablecloth came out, the roast went in the oven hours ahead of time, and the whole house filled with the smell of it long before anyone was allowed to sit down. Every other habit on this list, the cellar, the butchering, the canning, existed partly to make this one meal possible, week after week, without fail. Number 2. The full pantry shelf. Rows of jars, canned in late summer, catching whatever light came through the window, arranged so the oldest ones stood at the front and got used first. The trick was rotation, plain and constant. First in, first out, so that nothing put up with that much effort ever went to waste. And number 1, the TV dinner. In the fall of 1953, a company called Swanson found itself sitting on 260 tons of turkey nobody had bought for Thanksgiving. Rather than lose it, they packed it, along with cornbread stuffing and buttered peas, into a 3-part aluminum tray designed to look like a miniature television set, and priced it at 98 cents. They expected to sell a few thousand. They sold more than 10 million in the first full year alone. It offered something the whole system of cellar and crock and quilting bee never had to offer. An entire meal with no labor behind it at all. Nobody meant for it to be the end of anything. It was just easier. But somewhere in all that ease, a kitchen that had run for generations, on hands and patience, and nothing wasted, began to quiet down. Nothing left that kitchen with a use still left in it. That was true for a very long time, longer than most of us have been alive to witness. It wasn't that the old way was harder and the new way easier, though it was. It's that something got traded away in the exchange, so quietly, that nobody at the time could have named it. We gained convenience. We gave up the sense that everything in the house had a use, and that using it up completely was its own kind of quiet pride. There's a version of this same kind of story that still gets told today, not about a kitchen that's gone, but about a community that's still very much here. It circulates constantly online, usually attached to an old photograph, claiming that Amish women of the past knew some forgotten diet secret that kept them thin. It's a tidy story, built the same way a lot of nostalgia is built, around a loss and a longing. It's also not what the actual research found. Since we're already talking about what got lost, and what sometimes gets invented along the way, it's worth looking at what researchers who actually studied this measured for themselves. Number 8, the study behind the claim. In 2004, a team led by David Bassett at the University of Tennessee published a study in the journal Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. They gave pedometers to 98 adult members of an old order Amish community in southern Ontario and asked them to wear them for a week, logging their activity alongside a standard physical activity questionnaire. The Amish, as a community, still farm largely without engines, drive by horse rather than car, and do without most of the household machines the rest of North America has had for generations. That made them a rare living comparison point for what human activity levels looked like before modern convenience arrived. Number 7. The step counts. Amish men in the study averaged a little over 18,000 steps a day. Amish women averaged just over 14,000. For context, that is roughly 2.5 times the daily step count of a typical American adult at the time. Number 6. The weekly activity total. Men reported around 10 hours a week of vigorous physical activity and close to 43 hours of moderate activity on top of that. Women reported lower but still substantial numbers, with almost 40 hours of moderate activity most weeks. This was not exercise in the gym sense. It was mucking stalls, hauling feed and water, doing laundry by hand, walking between fields and buildings that a car or a machine would otherwise cover. Taken together, the researchers estimated that a working Amish adult could accumulate close to 48 hours a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, with no gym and no exercise program involved at all. Number 5. What was actually on the table? Here is the part that tends to get left out of the online version of this story. The same researchers looked closely at what these communities were actually eating, and it was not a light or restrictive diet. The typical Amish diet was high in calories, high in fat, and included plenty of refined sugar. Meat, potatoes, gravy, eggs, bread, pies, and cakes were all regular parts of the table. There was no calorie counting, no special ingredient, and no unusual technique being applied to the food itself. Number 4. The actual obesity numbers. And they were not zero. In that same study, 25% of the men and 27% of the women were classified as overweight by body mass index. 9% of the women were classified as obese. None of the men in the sample were. So this was a community with meaningfully lower obesity rates than the surrounding population, not a community where nobody carried extra weight at all. Number 3. What the researchers actually concluded. Put the activity numbers and the diet numbers side by side, and the conclusion becomes fairly clear. And it runs against the version of this story that usually gets told. It was not the food that was doing the work. The researchers were explicit about this in their own summary. The very high levels of physical activity, sustained by farm labor and a daily life built almost entirely around walking and manual work, were the likeliest explanation for the lower rates of obesity they observed, not any particular quality of what was on the plate. Number 2. The children told the same story. A follow-up study published a few years later by some of the same researchers looked at Amish children specifically and found much the same pattern. Amish kids in the study walked and moved dramatically more than their peers elsewhere, had almost no exposure to television or video games simply because those things weren't present in the home, and again showed lower rates of overweight and obesity that tracked closely with how much they moved rather than with anything specific about their meals. Number 1. The limits of the study, which matter as much as the findings. 98 adults in one Ontario community is a specific, limited sample, not a sweeping statement about an entire population, and Amish communities themselves vary quite a bit from one settlement to another in diet, occupation, and lifestyle. What the research supports is a fairly narrow and specific point. In the community these researchers studied, extraordinarily high levels of daily physical activity coincided with lower, though not absent, rates of obesity, on top of a diet that was rich in fat and sugar rather than restrictive. None of this makes for as tidy a headline as unspoken diet secrets, any more than a can of Crisco or a TV dinner makes for a simple story about progress. But both are the more honest version. A farm kitchen ran for generations on hands, patience, and the sense that nothing should go to waste, and something real was traded away when that changed. A living community still gets reduced again and again to a single flattering myth about an old photograph, and that's worth correcting every time it resurfaces. If any of this reached you, either part of it, a kitchen your own family remembers, or a headline you'd always taken as fact, it's worth carrying the real version forward instead. So tell me two things. What's the one item from your family's kitchen you can still picture the second you close your eyes? And had you already heard the Amish diet myth before today?